to you all now that a short time ago we found the remains of what we believe to be Colleen Adams. She was in the area indicated to us.
September 19th, 2018. A police car turns onto a quiet street in Maitland, a small town on South Australia's Yorke Peninsula. Nothing about the street looks unusual. A row of houses, a few cars in driveways, washing on a line somewhere down the block. The kind of place where, as far as most people are concerned, nothing ever happens. Inside one of those houses, a 70-year-old man sits down across from two detectives. He has told the same story for 45 years. A story about his wife packing 2 suitcases one morning, telling him their marriage was over, and getting into a stranger's car, never to be seen again. Today, for reasons only he fully understands, he stops telling it. He asks the officers to follow him outside. He walks a few steps into his own backyard, the same yard he has mowed, walked across, and lived beside for decades, and points to a patch of ground. Within hours, forensic teams are on their knees there with shovels and sieves, working the soil inch by inch. Tape goes up around the property. Neighbors step outside to watch. Nobody on that street has any idea what's about to be confirmed, just a few meters from where children once rode bikes up and down the footpath. By the next afternoon, they find human bone. For 45 years, Colleen Adams was listed as a missing woman. A mother who supposedly abandoned her 2 little girls without a word and simply vanished into someone else's life. Her family never believed that story, not for one single day. Now investigators are standing over the exact spot where the truth had been sitting the entire time, under the husband's own feet. This is the story of how it finally came out. Before she became a name on a cold case file, Colleen Adams was 24 years old, living in Maitland with her husband Geoffrey and their 2 daughters, Marie, 3, and Kay, just 18 months. Ask her sister, Heather Johncock, what kind of mother Colleen was, and the answer comes without hesitation. Colleen's site index equals 12-1 was a very loving mother. She loved her children and doted on them very much. That one detail sounds simple. In this case, it turned out to be everything, because from the very first day Colleen was gone, the story police were told did not match the woman her family knew. Behind closed doors, Colleen's marriage was under strain. Relatives later told investigators that she and Geoffrey had been having serious problems for some time. At one point, Colleen sought help from welfare services after Geoffrey allegedly tried to force her out of their own home. It was not, by any account, a peaceful household, but it was also, according to everyone who knew her, not a household Colleen was building toward leaving without her children. Whatever tension existed between the 2 of them, one thing never changed. Colleen doted on her girls. She built her days around them. Her family would later insist, again and again, over the course of decades, that a woman like that does not simply walk out the door one morning and never come back, not without a single phone call, not without a letter, not without ever once trying to reach the daughters she supposedly left behind. 2 small girls, a house on a quiet street, a mother who, by every account that survives her, never once stopped being present in her children's lives, until the morning she vanished from them completely. Her mother, Vera Milbank, believed Colleen would never have gone. Her sisters believed it too. Neither of Colleen's parents lived to see that belief proven true in a courtroom. Heather Johncock wasn't the only sister who spent decades holding on to that belief. Colleen's sister, Christina Burford, stood beside her, year after year, through every dead end and every silence, refusing to accept the official version of events, even when there was no evidence yet to contradict it. That is what makes this case different from a simple missing persons file. It isn't just about what happened to Colleen. It's about a family who knew, almost from day one, that the story didn't fit, and had to wait 45 years for the rest of the world to catch up to what they already believed in their bones. For 45 years, believing it was all the family could do. On the morning of November 22, 1973, Geoffrey Adams says he woke up in the home he shared with Colleen and found her already up, already dressed, standing in the bedroom with 2 suitcases packed and ready by the door. According to his account, Colleen told him their marriage was finished. She said she was leaving. Moments later, he claimed, she walked out of the house and got into a car driven by a woman he says he didn't recognize and drove away, out of Maitland and out of her daughter's lives. That was the entire story. For decades, it was the only account anyone had to work with. No witnesses, no neighbors who saw the car, no name for the woman supposedly driving it. Just one man's word. Notice what didn't happen next. No one called the police that day. No one called the police that week. It took a full month before Colleen's mother, Vera, finally went to authorities and reported her daughter missing. A delay that, on its own, should have raised questions no one asked at the time. Even then, the case did not move with any urgency. Colleen made no contact with her mother, no contact with her sisters, no contact with her own two daughters, who were growing up without her. There were no bank withdrawals under her name, no sightings reported anywhere in the state or beyond it, no trace at all of a woman who had supposedly just started a new life somewhere else. It took 6 more years, until 1979, before police formally reclassified her disappearance as a major crime investigation, after she still had not made contact with anyone who had ever known her. By then, whatever evidence might once have existed at a fresh scene had likely been gone for the better part of a decade, a missing person's trail that cold rarely leads anywhere on its own. Every year that passed made the silence look a little more like proof that Geoffrey Adams' story was simply true. It wasn't. Think about what that 6-year gap actually meant. A woman disappears. Her mother reports it. And then, for 6 years, the case sits classified as something less serious than a homicide, not actively worked as a potential murder, even though the woman at the center of it had never once, in all that time, made contact with a single person who loved her. 6 years is long enough for a toddler to start school, long enough for a case file to gather dust in a records room while the man at the center of it goes on living his life a few streets away. In 2001, acting on information available to them at the time, detectives launched a search at a local rubbish dump, hoping to finally find some physical trace of what had happened to Colleen almost 30 years earlier. They found nothing. For most families, a search like that closing empty-handed is close to the end of the road. Evidence degrades, memories blur, witnesses pass away. By the early 2000s, both of Colleen's parents had died without ever learning what became of their daughter, without ever hearing the words that would eventually be spoken in a courtroom 2 decades later. Heather Johncock later described what those decades of not knowing were like for the family in 3 plain words: it was very hard. The file went back into storage. Another 17 years passed with no new leads, no new witnesses, and, as far as anyone outside the investigation knew, no new reason for anyone to ever look again. Then, somebody decided to look again anyway. To understand how a case like this stays buried for 45 years, it helps to look at the gaps. A month passed before anyone reported Colleen missing at all. 6 years passed before police upgraded her file from a possible walkout to a major crime investigation. 22 more years passed after that before anyone searched for physical evidence, the 2001 dig at the local dump that turned up nothing. And then 17 more years passed before anyone picked the file up again. Add it together, and there is very little time across that 45-year span where anyone outside Colleen's own family was actively looking for her. For most of it, the file simply sat, waiting, while a version of events that was never true quietly hardened into the accepted one, repeated so many times, for so many years, that even some who doubted it began to run out of ways to challenge it. Meanwhile, Marie and Kay grew up. They went to school. They became teenagers, then adults, then mothers themselves, carrying a story about their own mother that neither of them had ever been able to confirm and neither of them had ever fully believed. Every year the case went unsolved. One man got to keep living exactly where he had put her. Cold cases are almost never solved in one dramatic moment. Far more often they're solved because someone, somewhere, sits down and goes through the entire file one more time. Every statement, every timeline gap, every detail that never quite added up the first time around. That is what happened with Colleen Adams' case. Investigators conducted a full review of everything on record. Geoffrey Adams' original 1973 statement, the 6-year delay before police treated the case seriously, the failed 2001 dump search, and every family interview collected along the way. They looked, in particular, at the parts of the story that had never made sense. A woman who doted on her children, walking away from them without a word. A husband who waited a month to even mention his wife was gone. A departure with no trace anywhere in the years that followed. No employment record under her name, no new address, no contact with a single person who had known her before November 1973. Detective Michael Newberry, who led the renewed inquiry, spoke publicly about where the investigation stood. He told reporters the team kept an open mind about exactly what had happened to Colleen and how, but they had reached a clear conclusion about the broader picture. In his words, police were now of the opinion that Colleen had been murdered. That single sentence marked a turning point. This was no longer, officially, a missing persons file. It was a suspected homicide. And a suspected homicide meant one thing above all else. Geoffrey Adams needed to be interviewed again, decades after anyone had last seriously challenged his account. 45 years after he first described the suitcases, the unfamiliar car, and the wife who supposedly walked away from her own children without looking back, Geoffrey Adams sat down across from detectives one more time. This time, the story that had survived for nearly half a century did not survive the conversation. There is no public record of exactly what shifted in that interview room. What question finally cracked a story that had held firm through decades of grief, 2 searches, and a family's relentless disbelief. What is known is simpler and, in its own way, more powerful. After 45 years of one account, repeated the same way every time, Geoffrey Adams changed his story. And once a story like that starts to change, it rarely stops halfway. On September 19, 2018, Geoffrey Adams told investigators the truth. He admitted that Colleen had never packed a suitcase. She had never argued that their marriage was over and walked out the door. She had never gotten into any stranger's car. She had never left Maitland at all. He told detectives that he had killed her, inside their own home, in 1973. And then he offered something no laboratory test or old witness statement could have provided on its own. He walked outside with police and showed them exactly where he had buried her, in the backyard of the very house he had continued to live in, mow, and maintain for decades afterward, while his daughters grew up believing their mother had chosen to abandon them. Excavation began almost immediately. Forensic teams marked out the ground, laid grid lines across the yard, and began working the soil by hand, sieving it section by section for anything that didn't belong. By September 20th, they had recovered human skeletal remains from beneath the yard, in the precise location Geoffrey Adams had pointed to the day before. Later testing confirmed what the family had feared, and in another sense had already known, for 45 years, the remains were Colleen's. Detective Superintendent Des Bray spoke to media about the significance of the find, the closing, at last, of one of the state's oldest unsolved case files, decades after the trail had gone cold, not once, but twice. For Colleen's family, the recovery of her remains delivered something that no piece of forensic evidence, on its own, ever fully can: an end to not knowing. Her daughter Kay, the 18-month-old baby left behind that November morning in 1973, now a grown woman with a lifetime of her own questions, said it as simply as it can be said. 4-1. Today, I have finally found my mother. After 45 years of hoping, we have found her. Geoffrey Adams was charged with the murder of his wife. The case went to a 7-day trial in South Australia's Supreme Court. Prosecutors laid out the version of events Colleen's family had believed for 45 years, that Geoffrey had killed her at home, buried her in the yard, and then constructed a story about suitcases and a mystery driver to explain her disappearance to police, to her family, and to their own 2 daughters who grew up just steps away from where their mother's remains lay the entire time. In August 2020, the jury delivered its verdict. They acquitted Geoffrey Adams of murder. Instead, the court accepted a guilty plea to the lesser charge of manslaughter. In his own account of what happened that night, Adams told investigators Colleen had been continuously having a go at me over nothing, his explanation for what led to her death, not an agreed statement of fact, and one this documentary presents clearly as his own characterization rather than a settled account of who Colleen was or how she behaved. Outside the courthouse, Heather Johncock spoke for a family who had waited nearly half a century for this moment. She had spent decades telling anyone who would listen that her sister would never have abandoned her children. Now, at last, a court had formally accepted that Colleen didn't leave. She was killed. But the word the jury chose was manslaughter, not murder, and John Cock did not pretend that felt like enough. At least he didn't get off, she said. It was not the verdict the family had hoped for after 45 years of waiting, but it was finally the truth, spoken out loud, on the record, in a courtroom, with Colleen's name attached to it, instead of a rumor about a woman who simply walked away. 7 days of testimony, evidence, and legal argument had done what 45 years of silence never could. They had turned Geoffrey Adams' story from the official record into a version of events a jury had formally rejected. For a family that had spent nearly half a century being told, implicitly, that maybe Colleen really had chosen to leave, that alone was its own kind of vindication, even wrapped inside a verdict that still left something to be desired. Geoffrey Adams was never sentenced for what he did. Before the court could hand down a punishment for the manslaughter conviction, it became clear that he was terminally ill with cancer. He died before a sentencing hearing could take place. The man who had kept the truth about his wife buried, literally and figuratively, for 45 years did not live long enough to hear a judge describe, in open court, what his actions had cost the people around him. For Colleen's family, that left the case resolved in an unusual, unsatisfying way. There was a guilty plea. There was, finally, a body to bury properly and a grave to visit, something the family had been denied for 45 years. But there was no final sentencing moment, no formal reckoning delivered to Geoffrey Adams himself, and no chance for the family to stand in court and describe, in their own words, exactly what those 45 years had cost them. There would be no photograph of Geoffrey Adams being led away in handcuffs for a sentence he would serve. No prison term to mark on a calendar. Cancer, not the justice system, decided how his story ended. For a family who had waited so long for a system to hold him accountable, that final outcome, silence, illness, and a death outside a courtroom rather than inside one, was its own kind of unfinished business. What remained in the end was not really about him at all. What remained was Colleen. Today, the disappearance and death of Colleen Adams is remembered as South Australia's oldest solved cold case disappearance. It wasn't solved with cutting-edge DNA science or some breakthrough piece of new technology. It was solved because, decades later, someone reopened an old file, asked the same questions one more time, and a story that had held together for 45 years finally didn't. It was solved because a husband, confronted again, walked outside and pointed at the ground. There is no dramatic forensic twist at the center of this case. No genetic genealogy database, no anonymous tip, no informant who finally broke ranks. Just a case file that refused to stay closed, and a detective willing to ask the same questions Colleen's family had been asking for 45 years. Questions no one else had bothered to ask again in almost 2 decades. For 45 years, that patch of earth sat under a family's ordinary life. Mowed on weekends, walked across every day, lived beside without a second thought, while 2 little girls grew up believing, or being told to believe, that their mother had simply chosen to go. She never did. Somewhere in Maitland, in a small suburban backyard that once held a secret for nearly half a century, there is now just grass. 2 little girls once played somewhere near that spot without knowing what was beneath it. They are grown women now, with children and grandchildren of their own.